This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Joshua, chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. It's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on June 15, 2025. It's part of our series called Gathered to Go, How to Serve Jesus Today. So let's hear the text from Joshua chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. I'll be reading from the New American Standard Bible and its 2020 revision. Now when the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, "Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from each tribe, and command them, saying, Take up for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are standing firmly, and carry them over with you, and lay them down in the encampment where you will spend the night." So Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the sons of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Cross again to the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of Israel. This shall be a sign among you, when your children ask later, saying, 'What do these stones mean to you?' Then you shall say to them, 'The waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it crossed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever." We want to take a look at this text in 2 different sections, verses 1 through 3, and then verses 4 to 7. Verses 1 to 3 describe the immediate events that followed the moment when all of Israel had crossed over the Jordan River. Now, Joshua has led the Israelites to the banks of the Jordan River near the city of Jericho. They have recently just defeated 2 different enemies who had threatened their entrance into the Promised Land. They have traversed over the wilderness for 40 years since their liberation from slavery in Egypt, and they have done so under Moses' leadership. It now falls to Joshua, Moses' successor, to lead the children of Israel into the Promised Land. Now, of the 12 tribes of Israel, 2.5 of them did not want to settle on the west side of the Jordan River. In other words, they weren't necessarily wanting to cross the river. Reuben was one of those, Gad the other, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. They made an agreement with Moses that you can read about back in Numbers chapter 32, that they would remain on the eastern side of the Jordan River. But Moses made them agree to assist the other tribes in taking the land that was west of the Jordan River. So our story in Joshua chapter 4 begins here kind of midstream. The Israelites have already now crossed over the Jordan River. Now, if we read the story just a bit earlier, going back to maybe chapter 3, we would have heard the story about how the priests were carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And as they approached the Jordan River to cross it, they stepped into the water. And as they stepped into the water, their feet never touched the water. Instead, the waters immediately parted with the flow of the North Sea, the flow of the Jordan River running north to south. The water stopped in the north and it was moved away in the south. So there was dry land in front of where the priest had taken that first step toward the water. So now, at this point in the story, the priest and the ark are still standing in the middle of the now dry crossing of the Jordan River, and the Israelites have already all crossed over the river. So it seems like all that needs to happen is the priest and the ark need to walk out of the river on its western bank, and the river starts flowing again, and the story continues. But instead, the Lord, Yahweh, speaks to Joshua with some additional instructions before the people can leave the bank of the Jordan River. Joshua is told to take 1 man from each of the 12 tribes for a mission. And if you read in chapter 3, he had already selected these people. And it's one of the issues in Joshua chapter 3 and chapter 4 that the chronology of it is all just a little bit confusing. The themes of what's going on are clear, but the chronology of how it all plays out, it seems a little odd. But Joshua's already picked these 12, one from each of the tribes of Israel. So while the priests are standing in the Jordan River with the ark, these 12 men are to go into the Jordan and each take one stone from the floor of the Jordan River. The stone is to be taken, and they're going to build what will be a monument with it. And in fact, there are two monuments. If you read the story carefully, this is also a little bit of the confusing part. Joshua makes a monument on the floor of the Jordan, which will be covered with water. And then these stones that they're being told to gather here are to be brought to the place where the Israelites are going to make their encampment for the night. So all of this opens up a key passageway to us here, and it's this, that faith requires obedience before meaning is clear. Let me say that again. Faith requires obedience before meaning is clear. There are many times in the Bible where people are commanded to do something strange. Jesus makes mud out of dirt and saliva and rubs it on the eyes of a blind man, and he receives his healing. You can pick up the book of Ezekiel, and he's told to lay naked in his front yard. You can read stories in these early books of the Jewish scripture where Moses throws his staff on the ground and it instantly becomes a snake. These are all these kind of ridiculous signs, which in many ways are meant to refute human agency or even luck. In other words, it's designed to make what's going to happen look even harder. And so God tells Joshua to go send 12 guys to collect some rocks from the bottom of the Jordan. Well, for what? Now, the meaning will become clear in the next verses, but we must not overlook the obedience here. Joshua hasn't been told what these stones are for yet. He just simply hears God tell him, get 12 guys, tell them to go into the floor of the Jordan River where the priests are standing, and each of them are going to pick up a stone, throw it over their shoulder, and come out. So they did exactly that. And why is that a key passageway for us? Well, remember, faith requires obedience before meaning is clear. So how do we listen to the voice of the Spirit of God with that same kind of readiness, that same kind of obedience, that same kind of practice? It really requires what Jesus tells us is a childlike faith that can sometimes embrace the ridiculous for the sake of what may come. So now we turn to the second part of this passage of Scripture, verses 4 to 7 of Joshua chapter 4. And in keeping with the key passageway I just spoke of, Joshua does exactly as he's asked to do. He calls 12 men together and he gives them the instruction that God has given him. He directs them to the place where the priests are standing in the middle of the dry Jordan River while they hold the Ark of the Covenant. They're still standing there in the middle of the river. So as I read the story, it always plays out in my head. What in the world is going on where these priests are just holding the Ark of the Covenant there for some indefinite period of time? Now, what's happening here is that they're each to pick up a stone. So there's 12 stones in all that they're required to pick up. They're large enough to be carried on the shoulder. So these are not small little rocks they're supposed to pick up, but stones that are heavy that they would carry on their shoulder. And then they're given the instructive. In other words, the text tells us what they're supposed to do. The first thing we learn is that these stones are going to be a sign for you. The second thing we learn is that when your children ask later, what do these stones mean to you, will happen. And that statement right there, what do these stones mean to you, is important because the grammar here is key. It's not what do these stones mean. That's not what it says in Hebrew. It says, what do they mean to you? So these stones are not just for a mere act of remembrance. In some ways, they're to call back to an experience that these Israelites had as they crossed the Jordan River. Their meaning, or the meaning of this event, is attached to their experience of the event. Remember, the question isn't what the children will later ask. What do these stones mean? That's not what they're going to ask. What do these stones mean to you is what they're going to ask. So first, this is going to be a sign. Second, when your children ask later, what do these stones mean to you? Number 3 then, the stones mean that the water was cut off when the Ark of the Covenant moved into the water. The control of water here is again important. Within kind of a Jewish theology, mythology, there was this sense in which only God could command and control the water. So when Moses parts the Red Sea and the children of Israel walk through it, that is clearly an act of God. The same thing happens here when the Jordan River is parted because of the priest standing in the middle of it with the ark. That's clearly an act of God. This parting of the Jordan River happens 2 more times in the Bible, 3 in all, including this story with Joshua. The first one is when Elijah parts the waters of the Jordan River to walk across to go to Mount Horeb. And then when Elisha succeeds him, he parts the waters of the Jordan River when he comes back after Elijah has been assumed into heaven. So the idea here of parting water becomes really significant, really important in the Bible. So we've got 3 parts of this. This is to be a sign for you. That's number 1. That's what the stones are for. Number 2, when your children ask later, what do these stones mean to you? That's the second part. The third is that the stones mean that the water was cut off when the Ark of the Covenant moved into the water. And then there's the fourth thing, that these stones will become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. These stones will be used to create a memorial monument. The word we use in Old English for this is Ebenezer, a monument of remembrance. They will commemorate the crossing of the Jordan, yes, but more how it was crossed. It's not that they crossed the Jordan alone. That's done by a lot of people. But it's really much more significant how they crossed it. And they crossed it by the power of the Lord. And that opens up a key passageway for us as we close. The monuments of God's work bear witness to God's greatness. You know, I've been a pastor over 30 years now, and every single church I've served has a culture that's very much like a culture followed by educational institutions and healthcare facilities, in that we have a culture of naming buildings and things after people to remember them. So in every church I've served, there's been some building, some room, some hall, some chapel that's been named after someone. And almost always it's named after a former pastor. Now, what I recognize, at least for me, is that with the last name Brown, hardly anyone is going to ever name anything after me, because why would you call something the Brown Chapel if it's painted white? Go figure. All that's to say is this, is that we find little of this notion in the Bible, that idea of naming things after people. But what we do find here are monuments to what God has done. We find these monuments to what God has done. They honor God. They help us to remember time and space when God moved. Monuments of God's work bear witness to God's greatness. Few of these exist in the life of the church, especially for Protestants. Now, while celebrating those who have gone before us is important, but sometimes part of what gets lost there is the story of how the power of God was at work in and through that person. Something for all of us we should really consider is that when we glorify the past, are we really just looking to what we think is a better day or a better time, or are we looking back to the moments of God's greatness so that we can be encouraged in our moment of challenge that we find ourselves in. A quick note about this podcast called Passages. It's migrating to a new feed. Many of you subscribe to this podcast on my own feed, revcraig.com. I would encourage you to please subscribe to the FFMC podcast feed, where you can find this very same podcast. So you can just search for 4 simple letters in your podcast app. Just search for FFMC. You'll find our church there with its kind of round logo and the 4 letters FFMC printed inside of it. Passages will be published each week, along with our sermons and other great content. So I'd encourage you to subscribe to our new feed. I'd encourage you also to visit our church's website, ffmc.org, to learn more about free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.